Hi, I'm Steve Peterson, and I've been in the game business for an awful long time, starting with tabletop role-playing game Champions, which Bill, as part of his lengthy career in the game business, was once exec producing at Cryptic Studios, the online version of. So we have a connection deep in the past.
We do, plus so much of my youth was misspent playing tabletop Champions, so that was wonderful.
And today the subject of our chat is ridiculous computation, which is another way of saying massive amounts of math, I guess. But the interesting part about that is what the limits are that we're reaching now with games, and how can computation help take us beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I've been fortunate enough to be old and having been in the games industry for, I think this is my 24th year. So I've firsthand really had a wonderful privilege of seeing how this has kind of evolved. When I started at Blizzard, the first game I worked on as an actual employee there was Warcraft: Orcs and Humans. I recall very specifically the first time that two of the people in the company, it was Ron Miller and Alan Adham, played a match against each other. They both came out of their office. They were like, "Yes, that was awesome. I completely kicked your ass." And they were like, "No, I kicked your butt." And they realized we actually had a desync bug, so they both won the game. So step one, your game is better if somebody wins. But the thing we realized is they were both so excited about it because for the first time we had an experience where they realized they were playing someone else, right? There was both that connectivity of that they were playing a game where they knew a live human was on their side, and that competition that came along with that. This is back when if you were going to have an awesome event, you were throwing a LAN party, your friends were lugging their giant computers over, you were setting them up, getting maybe 4 people playing together. Fast forward across all the years, now we have thousands of people connecting, playing in these same worlds. And I think the thing that's interesting though is we do keep bumping into this same wall. It's a bigger space we play in, but that paradigm that limits us is having everything on that single game server, right? As game designers and developers, we are kind of trained over the years to think reductively. How do we fit everything into there, and how do we really tune and tweak it to the maximum effect possible to get the most out of it? But we still hit this wall, and that wall really centers around the fact that it comes down to a computer science problem. You can only do so much computation in the same box that you're running the game loop, that you're figuring out your AIs, that you're doing your pathfinding, that you're doing your physics. Everything is in that single space. So the thing that becomes exciting and interesting, and why I joined Improbable, is the idea of, well, what if we can take that and distribute that, right? And use the power of the cloud to be able to do massive distributed compute, and then how does that remove these blocks and let us jump over these walls?
So break the limitations of one box, no matter how powerful that box might be, and be able to go to the cloud and use the near infinite resource of massive server farms to handle AI computation and to handle pathfinding and all the algorithms necessary to do anything you want to do.
Basically, if it sucks down compute, we want to distribute it to let you do more.
But it's still, there's other issues though, like latency, and you have to be able to gather all the data from all the people efficiently and process it and send the results back.
Yeah,
you have things like CCP, when they have massive battles in EVE Online, things slow to a crawl, and it's...
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, but again, currently the biggest limit comes from the fact that you're still running all that through that single system, right? We find that when we are doing our scale tests, when we're working with developers right now that are on Spatial OS, what we find is because we have the servers co-located in the same space, that transfer time is nominal. And in fact, we've actually found that some games have better performance because they are able to break out these computationally heavy elements of their game design from the core game loop. So it actually lets them, through that distributed work that they do, over here have something running that is very computationally heavy while the game loop still moves over here and then feeds the data back in. So it's interesting, it's a very different way of thinking about writing code and about developing games and what you can actually unlock in terms of game design. But it starts to really open up more of, I think something that's interesting, we've all kind of been talking around here, whether it's the leisure economy, which we kind of think of as an effort economy. The effort I put into a game should benefit me back. AI in games, Ready Player One, like all these things that we want to have more people in a society and together, and it all comes to having a backbone there that will actually support those kind of dreams and those goals and those products that people want to develop.
Well, so what are some of the games today that we can look at that would benefit from this kind of architecture, this opening up of cloud computing resources on a massive scale? What limitations in games that exist now could be changed or removed?
I always kind of look at it from three standpoints, right? So one is scale. Obviously, whether that's the actual size of the world, having a huge seamless space that players are playing together in, the number of players you can bring together, or just the number of entities, whether those are enemies or trees or rocks, anything you're associating with properties. The second is really anything that is complex systems, really computationally heavy. That could be AI, that could be extremely complex pathfinding that takes advantage of changing environment, that can be distributed physics. So anything that normally would just take down massive amounts of either a player's computer or a compute in the cloud, or a compute on a single server can be distributed amongst the cloud. And then the third is persistence. Like, so what does it mean if you actually have a world that never shuts off, that can evolve and change over time? The simplest way, I actually heard somebody at GDC ask us the question this way, which I thought was great. They said, so if we're in a game together and I walk in a room and I turn that light on and then I leave, the light stays on. I'm like, yes, that is exactly right.
And the light went on in your head.
And the light went on. I was like, yeah, that's exactly right. So, that's a very simple thought towards it, but what does it mean if I can have a world that's a simulation that's constantly running, and whether I'm there or not, or whether players are there or not, and then how does that impact play, or what could be used for that in games? So, I mean, what games can benefit from that? I tend to think it's not limited. The easy one, and the one that I think a lot of people think about instantly, is MMOs, right? What does it mean if you could have that many players in a bigger world? But I look at what that means in terms of building really compelling meta stories in ways to tie like arena combat style games, where what you're doing in that 15-minute gameplay session, how could that tie into a broader, bigger narrative and story, and how that brings people together? There's so many different games that it applies to, and I think we'll start seeing genres start coming out as we start to think more expansively as designers.
Or perhaps combinations of genres where at one level crossing domains is something that games find very hard to do. I could have a game where I'm a general real-time strategy game and I'm sending troops to different areas, and then be able to jump into one of those troops and do a first-person shooter with a bunch of other people, and yet see the results of the assault that's happening with other troops in the next town or whatever.
Yeah.
And, yep. That's not really possible today. That's just too much to ask.
And to expand on even that idea, Steve, the fact that we then view what's happening in a game as a single data plane. So the fact that you might be on your PC playing this strategy type game where you're giving orders and setting goals and looking at the battlefield as an entire battle map. On consoles or the PC, like players are in playing a first-person shooter, I could be on my mobile device, right? And now on there, I've got drones, and there's a whole gameplay around like flying drones and tagging information and doing drone strikes that is purely a mobile experience, and it all takes place in the same massive battle and simulation. And how does that then start bringing about that reality of actual meaningful cross-platform play? Yeah,
people getting to do different roles. Maybe I'm not very good at fast twitch gameplay, but you're better at it, or I'd like to run the drones and you want to be in the midst of the battle calling in for my support. We've seen a little bit of that hinted at, but not on a large scale kind of game. And I think. Do you think we could see expanding the game audience by providing more variety in the kind of roles that people might have in a game?
I absolutely do, right? To keep riffing off of this concept, right? You might have people that don't want to be even involved in combat, right? What they want to do is being a medic, but not what we think of as a medic in a first-person shooter now, right? They're like, I never pick up a weapon, I run a hospital, I heal people. The more medics you have that come in can actually then build structures together that allow to heal more people from the front. You're doing, frontline medicine. You're actually working together with other like-minded people to create those things. You might want to play a journalist in that type of setting, right? What you're trying to do is capture the epic horrors of war, right, and report that back out. Maybe that's something that streamers would want to do, right, as opposed to actually being in the game. They're like, oh no, I'm going to find the best places to actually capture what's happening and build my reputation and my audience that way. So, I mean, I do think that, one I always think of is, which sounds maybe even a little silly, right, but what if you wanted to play in a fantasy game, but you really wanted to be a baker? That was your big thing. You're like, I love cooking. I actually want to do this in a meaningful way. And there's a depth of gameplay that's there that supports that you are working with other players and you're sourcing the best, eggs or flour or whatever that is. And then eventually your goal is that, I'm going to be the person that provides all of the delicious baked goods at this massive feast that this player who has come up through a completely different path right now is basically, let's say, the queen of this entire kingdom. And they're hosting a feast where they're bringing the 5 other heads of other kingdoms there to show off like how awesome they are and how big their guild is. But what they want to do is provide these best, digital representations of things to show off how powerful and influential they are, that I could be a part of that. And that would be incredibly fulfilling for me, right? And I could generate revenue that way, whether it's for my character in the real world as we start looking at these, leisure economies.
Yeah, and especially if the world's persistent and can keep track of all these things. I mean, and I can see other layers too where, well, you used to be an adventurer, and then you got to
then I took an arrow to the knee, that's right.
You took an arrow to the knee or whatever, and then you became a baker. But then at the feast, you see somebody sneaky, and you pull out the knife, and because he didn't expect that at all because he didn't know you were.
That's right, didn't know who you were, right? There's like, say, every fantasy novel or tabletop RPG has the bartender who used to be the warrior, right?
Yeah.
And they have the Minotaur head above the bar that they hunted, right? So I think it's really interesting, like, what if that actually happened, right? When you played a character long enough, you're like, I want to retire from this, but I'm going to do this other thing I want to do. And it could be actually meaningful, and it could draw upon what you did before, because there is that massive world that you're able to build, right? And then how are you bringing in other elements we've talked about, you're hearing us talk about during this conference, like coming in with, with blockchain and like having items that have persistence that are there, of ownership, but then putting in a world where the world is always there, and the fact that it grows. Like, what does it mean if you actually have a character where you're like, if you think about the massive amounts of people that love playing Farmville, right?
Yeah.
Like, what if they were doing that in an actual rich, massive world where the farming they were doing allowed them to interact with players that were doing very different things, right? The warrior that's got to have that hardtack to be able to eat and live, to go off and do his big adventure, that actually came from somewhere rather than just some, dumb NPC that sells you an item.
And people could trade, or you could travel and see different farms. Or, I think, what I like to call this concept is massively personal online role playing. Where you're getting more of what you're interested in because you're helping to create it, and it's persistent, and you are dealing with people who are your friends or becoming your friends, or but the world would have a richness just from persisting for a while.
Yeah, and the fact that the things you do could become meaningful, right? It's really fascinating. I think there was a split that occurred in gaming where it's like one part of our industry went towards massively multiplayer games, into online gaming, and what those experiences could be, or just being even online and competitive gaming. And then this other side went to what I always think of as massively single-player games, right? We have these like incredibly rich worlds, these very, very deep experiences where you as a character matter immensely to what happens in that world. And we're at the point now where these two concepts should join back up, right? And you could have these huge, massive, rich, deep worlds where what players do is meaningful, what their place in that world is meaningful. And it's not because you're standing in line to decide who gets to kill the Goblin King, right?
Yeah.
But it's more that you're all interacting in a very deep way. And really the way to achieve that stuff is by having these just like, ridiculously complex systems that require that level of compute, that we're now at a point technologically where we're able to start solving these design problems by applying computer science.
And plus the universality of good mobile devices means, and good powered mobile devices, means that you could really do this all the time with a huge audience, and not just somebody who's bought an expensive computer or somebody who's bought an expensive console.
Yeah, I think it's very true, and one of the things we think about a lot is this concept of the multiversal self, right? So I am who I am in my day-to-day life, but now how can I go in and through whatever my device is, right? Like be able to actually interact and have this other persona, this other meaningful existence that goes in through. And I think that if we can take the depth of what we think of as traditional console and PC games, match that with the accessibility and immediacy and the reach of mobile, right? And you start putting these things together, that's when we start seeing, the first multi-billion-dollar games just exploding, like trillion-dollar games happening, which sounds insane, but everyone that's been on this stage has talked about this explosion and the fact that it goes beyond entertainment, starts becoming a way of life for people, and I definitely think that's true.
Well, that's all we have time for, but thank you, Bill. His company, Improbable, is on the forefront of making this kind of thing happen, and I urge you to check it out and their spatial OS. Thank you very much. We'll be around.